Hey, greetings folks! Welcome back to Sean's Irish Whiskey Shelf, coming at you from the heart of the United States here in the Midwest. Now, what I have for you today is Powers Irish Whiskey, and what's on the table in front of you are all four of the bottles that I keep on my shelves. I think there's a couple more bottles that they have that I haven't added to my collection yet. We'll get there someday, but these are the four primary ones that you can find throughout the United States. Now, Powers Irish Whiskey is distilled at the Midleton Distillery, and of course Midleton they're just a powerhouse of fine whiskeys. I mean, come on, you got the Spots, you've got Redbreast, you've got Powers here, Method and Madness, Jameson. I mean, just great whiskey all the way around. And Powers is a great representation of that because these are all very, very reasonably priced, and you cannot go wrong with any of these four bottles. You could spend a lot more money on whiskey and get whiskey that's nowhere near as good as this. So these are really good bottles of whiskey, and if you see one, you probably ought to pick it up and try it. So I was kind of curious about where Powers Whiskey got its start. Every bottle has a little stamp on top, says established 1791. And I got curious about, okay, well, 1791. How did we get here from there? What has happened with Powers Whiskey from its inception back in 1791 up until today in 2023? So I did a little bit of research, and I put together, just a little short video about the history of Powers Whiskey, and I'd like to share that with you. So why don't you grab a drop of whiskey? Hopefully it's Powers if you have it. If not, well, whatever you might happen to have, but get yourself a drop of Irish whiskey and watch this little video about the history of Powers Distillery.
Powers Irish Whiskey is named after its first distiller, Mr. James Power. Now, James was an innkeeper in Dublin, and his inn was located at 109 Thomas Street. In 1791, he established a small distillery at the inn and sold his whiskey under the name James Power and Son. The small distillery was able to produce around 6,000 gallons of whiskey per year. In 1822, the distillery was moved to a new location over on John's Lane, which was a side street off Thomas Street. The whiskey was then called John Power and Son, and the new distillery had 3 pot stills installed. Production continued to increase at the new distillery, and after the distilling laws in Ireland were reformed in 1823, growth became even more pronounced. Just over 160,000 gallons of whiskey were produced in 1827, and by 1833, that number increased to 300,000 gallons of whiskey produced. Now, as the distillery continued to grow, so too did the stature of the family. Members of the family were becoming more prominent in the community, with Sir James Power, son of John Power and grandson of the founder James Power, becoming High Sheriff of the city of Dublin in 1859. And this is just one example of the different high-profile positions held by the family during the mid-1800s. Now, the distillery continued to grow and become even more prosperous. In 1871, the distillery was rebuilt and was then considered to be one of the most impressive sites in Dublin. By this time, the distillery was producing 700,000 gallons of whiskey per year, and that increased to around 900,000 gallons per year by the 1880s. The Powers Distillery was now a very profitable operation, covering 6 acres of land in Dublin and employing around 300 people. And they didn't just employ their workers. Seasonal workers were provided with full room and board, keeping them out of the way of Dublin landlords who could at times be considered somewhat unscrupulous. All workers were given beach days, and they were also given away days at the family estate. Powers believed that Happy workers made incredible whiskey, so even though it might have been considered overkill at the time, it was a good trade-off for the company. The familiar Diamond P trademark that we've all come to see on Powers bottles these days was registered in 1877, and obviously it remains the whiskey's trademark to this day. In 1889, Baby Power hit the market. This was the distillery's attempt to get their whiskey even more distribution by bottling their whiskey in miniature bottles. They were the first distiller to ever do this. They felt that if they could put their whiskey into these small bottles, it would make it easier for people to take the whiskey wherever they wanted to go without having to bring around a larger bottle. So the next time you see mini bottles on an airplane, or at the hotel, maybe your mini bar, or at your local liquor store, say a silent thanks to Powers for that invention. The 1880s also saw the Powers Distillery become one of the big four of Irish whiskey. Along with Powers, this included John Jameson, William Jameson, and George Roe. Irish whiskey production continued to increase at this time, and several new innovations were introduced by Powers. For example, in 1886, Powers began bottling their own whiskey. Now at the time, the usual practice was to distill the whiskey first and then ship the whiskey off to merchants and bonders to be bottled. Powers was the very first Dublin distillery to bottle their own whiskey, and one of the first in the world to do that. Incidentally, this is where the name Powers Gold Label came from, as each bottle that the distillery produced had a gold label attached to it. The distillery was noted for its cleanliness and how modern the facility was. By the late 1880s, the distillery was running 5 stills, 2 of which had capacities of 25,000 gallons each, making them among the largest ever built. Powers also tried to make the most efficient use of their space as possible. Now, tillable land was somewhat difficult to find in Dublin, so some of their workers successfully petitioned the company to let them grow crops on the roof of the distillery. This gave them access to more of the raw materials they needed to make their whiskey. In 1893, Powers went to the Chicago World's Fair. Now by now they were quite proud of their whiskey, and the display they put up at the World Fair showed that pride. They made a 30-foot tall tower of Powers Gold Label whiskey. As they put on their website, "We wanted the world to know that we were making some of the best whiskey out there, and, well, subtlety didn't join us for the trip." It's pretty clear by the Tower of Bottles that definitely subtlety did not make that trip. Sir Thomas Talbot Power was the last of the Power family to sit on the board of the distillery. He passed away in 1930. Now, ownership remained in the family until 1966, however, with several descendants working for the distillery until only very recently. 1900 was a milestone year, not only because it was the turn of the century, but Powers Johns Lane Distillery, for the first time ever, produced in excess of 1 million gallons of Irish whiskey. 1920 saw Powers Irish Whiskey being sold in over 100 cities around the world. In 1961, a coffee still was installed at the distillery, providing the ability to distill vodka and gin. Now, you may remember from my episode featuring Amias Coffee's High and Wicked Irish Whiskey as this type of still being called a coffee column still. This type of still also provided grain whiskey that could be used in the testing of making blended whiskeys. Now, this was a big change in the Irish whiskey world, as it was still considered by the Dublin distillery dynasties at the time that grain whiskey made in coffee stills could barely even be considered Irish whiskey. But consumer sentiment was changing. and there was a growing preference for blended Irish whiskey over the traditional pot still whiskey, and Powers wanted to be ahead of the curve and capitalize on that. Now, Powers was able to convince a few other distilleries that considering grain whiskey as a possible ingredient for making blended whiskey could potentially save their operations. Many other distilleries failed to react to that change, however, and along with the still lingering after effects of Prohibition in the US, has caused many distilleries to close their doors for good. So, exactly how did Powers end up at the Midleton Distillery? Well, in 1966, Irish whiskey distillers continued to struggle. Not only were there still the after effects of Prohibition that we mentioned a few minutes ago, there was also the Anglo-Irish trade war. You also had rising competition from Scotch whiskey distillers. So because of that, Powers, along with Cork Distilling Company and John Jameson and Sons, formed a group called Irish Distillers. Now, these were the only distillers remaining in the Irish Republic. They decided to close the doors on their individual distilleries and consolidate all of the operations at a new distillery to be built in Midleton. That distillery became the New Midleton Distillery, and it was built next to the old Midleton Distillery, located up in County Cork. The new distillery opened in 1975, and that permanently closed the doors of the Powers Distillery, located on Johns Lane. It also saw many of their traditional pot still whiskeys reformulated into blends to further meet prevailing consumer tastes and demands. In 1989, Irish Distillers became a subsidiary of the French firm Pernod Ricard, which it still remains to this day. Now, today, Powers Irish Whiskey can primarily be found in 4 different varieties, at least here in the United States. You have your standard Powers Gold Label, which is a blend of pot still and grain whiskeys. It's matured in ex-American oak bourbon casks, and it is non-chill filtered. You have the Powers 3 Swallow. This is a single pot still, also matured in ex-bourbon casks, with a little bit of whiskey also matured in ex-Oloroso sherry casks. You have the Powers Johns Lane. This is a single pot still, but it's 12 years old, matured mostly in ex-bourbon casks, again with some whiskey also matured in ex-sherry casks. And the newcomer is Powers Irish Rye. This is distilled in a column still. It's matured in virgin American oak casks and ex-bourbon casks, and the rye, 100% of the mash billows rye, is sourced from County Wexford.
All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that little bit of history lesson about the Powers Distillery and Powers Irish Whiskey, and I hope you liked this video. If you do, man, take a second to go down and click the thumbs up, give me a like, maybe subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, and share the video with anyone else you think might be interested in Irish whiskey. It would mean an awful lot to me if you did 1 or 2 or all 3 of those things. And don't forget, I answer every comment. You want to leave me a comment on the YouTube channel, leave me a comment on my Facebook page. I'll answer every comment. I'd love to know what you're drinking, love to know what you've tried. Tell me if you've tried any or all of these Powers Irish whiskeys. And let me know what you thought. So, you know, we can't have a video without having a drop of whiskey. So we're going to get to it, right? Okay, Powers Gold Label. This is their standard Irish whiskey. It's been around since 1791, and obviously it was a single pot still at first. Now it's a blend. Still, to me, even though I'm a single pot still guy, I just can't say enough about Powers Gold Label. This is really just a fine, fine bottle of whiskey. It's their flagship, if you will. You're looking at 86.4 proof, and I think it would probably give Tullamore Dew a run for its money for my everyday sipper, and I'll show you why. Yeah, fantastic bottle of whiskey. I think it has maybe just a little bit more of the alcohol burn to it than Tullamore Dew has. I think Tullamore Dew might be just a wee tiny bit smoother than Powers Gold Label. But I tend to cut my whiskey with an ice cube or maybe 2 little ice pellets when I have it in the evening. And that doesn't dilute the flavor very much, but it does kind of take that little bit of burn out. So overall, fantastic drop of whiskey. My only gripe about here, I can't find it in a big bottle. The biggest I can find here is a 750. So if I could get it in a 175, this might be an everyday sipper for me, along with Tullamore Dew. All right, the Powers 3 Swallow. We've talked about this one in the past. This is a single pot still whiskey, and it is also 86.4 proof. So it's a little bit more, I think, like what you might have found back in the day, because it is single pot still. And I seem to recall when we tried it before that it was quite good. And let's see if we remember that correctly. And yes, we do. We definitely remember that correctly. In fact, it doesn't even have as much of the overall alcohol burn that the blend does. And I'm wondering if some of that, after looking at the history of what Powers Distillery has done, you know, they've incorporated pot still whiskey with grain whiskey. And that grain kind of gives it a little bit more of that alcohol burn, perhaps. This is just pure single pot still. I don't know, that's my guess. I can just tell you from my blue collar palate that this is a smoother drop of whiskey than the blend is. And again, I'm probably a little biased to single pot still, but right now I haven't found either bottle to be objectionable, and I'd drink either one as much as you gave it to me. All right, let's go on over here to Powers Johns Lane. Now, recall from the history that the first distillery that they opened outside of the inn or the pub was on Johns Lane, and that's why this is called Powers Johns Lane. It's in remembrance, or you know, paying homage to their first distillery there on Johns Lane. Now, this is also a single pot still, but it's been aged for 12 years. So you got a little bit more age on it. It's 92 proof, so it's going to have a little more kick to it. I also recall that this was really quite good. So let's check her out. And yeah, it is really quite good. For 92 proof, that's, folks, that is a fine drop of whiskey. And look, none of these bottles up here should run you more than $100. That's what I'm saying. You're gonna spend a reasonable amount of money for any of these 4 whiskeys. And they're fine whiskeys. So to be able to get a 12-year-old whiskey for less than $100, and yeah, you can do that with Tullamore Dew. The Tullamore Dew 12 was about 70. I think the Powers Johns Lane was right in that range, 70 to 80, I think, somewhere in there. Which is better, though, the Tullamore Dew 12 or the Powers 12? Maybe that's the subject of an upcoming video. 2 of our lower priced 12-year-olds, because you know we got Redbreast 12 up there, and you're going to pay more for that than you are for Powers. But, you know, maybe we'll give some of those 12-year-olds a try. All right, now, the newest bottle to the shelf we need to try. This was just released within the past year. Powers Irish Rye. Now, where these are all single pot still, or a blend of single pot still, single grain, this is 100% rye, folks. Comes from County Wexford, I believe is where they source their rye from. Yep, 100% rye mash. This is a 6.4 proof, just like the first two. I am a rye drinker. If I'm not drinking Irish whiskey, then I'm probably drinking rye. Bullet rye is one that I enjoy. Templeton rye, I enjoy that from time to time. We have a local distiller here, Nefarious. I like their rye. So I was really interested to see what the Powers Irish Rye was going to taste like. And like the first three, I was not disappointed. Not one little bit. Watch. So you're going to get a different flavor profile with the rye than you will from these. You have to. It's 100% rye. We're not talking malted or unmalted barley. We're talking pure rye. So you're going to get a much different flavor profile. But for someone who's a rye drinker, this right here, oh my goodness, folks, that is just a great bottle of whiskey. Look, I've said it a couple times on this episode. These are 4 fantastic bottles. If you see any of these on your shelf, or on a shelf at your local liquor store, supermarket, wherever you go to buy whiskey, and you've never tried one before, at least start with the gold label. See what you think. If you're like me, and perhaps you like single pot still a little better, these two you're just not going to go wrong with at all. And if you want to branch out and try something a little different, hey, give the Powers Irish Rye a try. It's a fantastic whiskey that has its own unique flavor profile from Powers, and by association from Midleton. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making it. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I thank you for your time in watching it. Thank you to those who have liked and subscribed in the past. You know, I started all this with expectations that I probably wouldn't get more than a handful of views and a handful of subscribers, and it's grown a little bit over time. Kind of hit a plateau here, but I'm hoping some more will eventually find the channel and get some value out of it. I'm always trying to improve the look of the channel. You'll notice this time I'm standing up now instead of sitting behind the table. I prefer to be standing up, and I will be building a bar here sometime in the next few months. It's going to be a little while, but we'll get a real bar set up here to go along with the shelves. So I'm just happy that you folks are watching and hopefully enjoying this, because I sure do enjoy doing this with you. So until we meet again, enjoy your Irish whiskey, because any reason to have a drop of Irish whiskey is a good reason. But remember, do it responsibly so you can be back here for the next video. Should be next week or within a week. And, you know, I hope you folks just try this. Seriously, give these a try. So, be well and be safe. Sláinte. Bye now.